So, Dr. Kate Balestrieri's book, A Sex Therapist's Guide to Reclaiming Lost Desire, Connection, and Pleasure. Kate, hello.
Hello. How are
I
you?
am so delighted to have you today
Oh, I'm
as
so
our guest. And what we're waiting for, Lamore is now joining, and Dr. Maureen Slattery. This book is exquisite.
thank you.
This book is so important. And I think now more than ever, we're going to be needing the tools. I have to invite Maureen. So,
Mm.
can you start by telling us a little bit about how you ended up giving birth to this book and also to your Modern Intimacy Institute?
Yeah, thanks. Modern Intimacy started about 5 years ago. Hi, good morning.
Good morning.
And Modern Intimacy is a group practice. So I've got a bunch of really incredibly talented therapists and coaches, and we practice nationally, focusing on things that, people want to work on relevant to sex and relationships. So we've been doing this a long time and feel really passionately about it. And that's where the book was born too. In the work that we do, all of us sex therapists, sex health professionals, we see themes in our practices coming up around what is separating people from their desire, what's getting in the way, what's making it hard for them to feel connection with their sexuality. And I just started clocking some of those themes, and that was the genesis of the book.
Well, the book is amazing. The first thing that you do is you come in and you talk about right off the bat that you lost access to your sex life for a bit. And that authenticity, I think, is so important. The first part of the book is about the internal factors that may be going on. The second part of the book is really about the external, including relational factors. And the third part is what we can do about it.
Yeah, putting into action, finding solution. It's really, really important and powerful to have some steps that people could tangibly take.
So, what is your favorite part of the book for you? When you write a book, we
This book
love
or
our
this?
book babies.
Yes. Honestly, probably this part. This part, the getting to talk with people that I love and respect in the field, and letting people out in the world know that it exists. I think sex is something that still in 2025 is really hard for a lot of people to talk about and even to think about, right? So I think the more we normalize conversations like this out in the public, the easier it is for other people to say, hey, wait a minute, that's something I want to think about a little bit more deeply and really prioritize in my life. So that's the gift of writing a book like this, is that other folks go, yeah, I get to think about my own sex life and make it something important again.
And we know that pleasure is not a luxury, it's a necessity for a well functioning brain, mind, life. And I think many people are experiencing what we call anhedonia, or the inability to access their pleasure. And I think, a lot of us, speaking from myself, we live in our pain bodies. And right now, with what's going on outside of us,
Yeah. Yeah.
so can you talk a little bit about how we can navigate the kind of stresses that we're having? Because the external stressors now are kind of, I think, really weighing upon a lot of us.
Yeah, I hear that. I hear that and I feel that. I think the best way maybe to address it is just to share that a few years ago I read this really incredible book called Pleasure Activism, and it really changed my relationship with pleasure. And speaking to what you mentioned just a few minutes ago, Nan, pleasure, I think a lot of people think is something that we have to earn. It's something that we have to be ready for. We have to quote unquote deserve it. And as a therapist, I've always taught when I teach other therapists and other psychologists that self-care, pleasure, rest, these things are mandates in our field, because if we're not taking care of ourselves, we're not able to really show up for the folks that we work with. But when I read Pleasure Activism, that book is a series of essays, stories, and papers by different folks, all about how pleasure can literally be a form of resistance and activism in the face of oppression. And that really set off just a whole cascade of light bulbs for me about the necessity and importance of pleasure, not just as individuals, but as a collective. And so I remember that book a lot, and the powerful messages in it when I look at what's going on in the world right now. And I think every moment that I can steal away for a moment of pleasure, whether it's sexual or non-sexual, is my little FU to what's going on out there that's out of my control. And it's important that we give our nervous system these neurochemicals, these endorphins, these pleasure feel goods. It's rejuvenating, and it gives us the opportunity to kind of regroup, recenter, recollect, and make some changes.
Okay, I've got to let Lemur's having trouble getting in, so let me again invite her in. One of the things I'm also thinking about is in the idea of pleasure activism, the work to promote ourselves and our human rights can be a pleasurable activity. So what I'm thinking about is
Hi,
Lemur.
everyone. I'm so sorry.
That's not your fault. That's one of the downsides of this platform, is it's sometimes really hard for people to get on.
Yeah.
Anyway, keep going. It's super interesting. I've been
So
listening.
what I was saying is that, when we think about being called forth in our communities, I mean, I got this from Dr. Candace Nicole, too, Hargens, when we were on her book launch. It's all about the community. This is what feeds people. So if we think of our call to action to organize in our community, to connect with people, to really take stands, it's kind of like bringing back some of the nice parts of the 60s for me. I was a little too young to be out there, protesting. But if we take this as we feel good about taking a stand with our communities and getting out there, and doing whatever we can, in addition to making sure that we're having pleasure, seeing how we can advocate together as a pleasurable, community-based kind of thing. And I'm praying that what this brings out in everybody is getting them off their devices and into the communities. And actually showing up in the communities, getting door to door, person to person, where people are going to really be able to feel each other.
I hope so too, and I think you're right. I think our devices can be wonderful in bringing connection forward, but there really isn't much to replace that in-person connection. It's a different biofeedback experience, and it's really powerful.
So we're all taking some very deep breaths.
Yeah.
And you remember, the brain depends on two signals for everything: pain and pleasure. And ideally, pain is a signal that something isn't good for us, that we should move away from. And pleasure, ideally, is a signal that something feels good and is good for us, what I call healthy hedonism. And so, the idea that the pleasure system isn't working hobbles the ability for us to be able to work with our core emotions, to be able to be effective, to get our needs met. And our big need is connection.
Yeah. Connection of all kinds, right? Not just romantic, but connection of all kinds: platonic, familial, community, collegial, all of it.
And it starts with self-connection, being in our bodies and listening to our bodies, getting that information, moving the body and being in the body. Because I think a lot of what you write in the book about things that shut us down, objectification, where our bodies exist for other people.
Yeah.
Another thing you talk about is when partners have sexual entitlement,
Yeah.
where they think they deserve that you're supposed to give the sex. So, when you think about it, there's a lot of factors that are systemic, I think, that contribute to how it's challenging for women to experience themselves not as objects of pleasure, but as the embodied experiencers of pleasure.
Yeah, I don't think that experience is unique to women. I think it is something that people of all genders experience, but definitely women and people in sort of femme presenting bodies really, really get objectified, and they get this feedback from the world that their value is only in so much as they are fuckable,
Yeah.
right? And then also they are disgraced for being fuckable. So there's a real dilemma that comes up for people who are struggling to kind of find autonomy and ownership of their own sexuality in a way that's free from this messaging that is so constant. I mean, it's inescapable.
Yeah.
So I do talk a little bit about that in the book. How do you figure out, are you being objectified? Are you self-objectifying? How does that feel different than desire in your body, in your pleasure, in your yes? And how do you communicate that to other people?
And thank you for making the point that it does cross genders, and that, I think it really shows up where people are heads on a stick.
Yeah.
So there's so much in their mind.
Mm-hmm.
They're so out of their bodies.
Mm-hmm.
And when they're like trying to have sex, I know a lot of the men that I'm working with, and I work with a lot of men, they're performative. They're in their heads, as opposed to connected in their experience.
Yeah. But men get a lot of this messaging in media too, especially if they subscribe to any kind of manosphere or men with podcast media, because those men really reiterate a dangerous message to other men, that is, you're only as valuable as your pocketbook, your abs, or your height, and those are really objectifying domains. And men rightfully complain about how they're sort of reduced to these variables. And that's really not messaging that's coming from women. That's coming from systemic messaging about how people should show up in their performance of gender. And I think it's really important that we do expand the conversation of objectification, because, when we are objectified and dehumanized over and over again because of our gender, the color of our skin, another variable about us, we really lose the ability to, I shouldn't say we lose, but we are stripped of our ability to understand a more holistic and integrated experience of who we are as humans, but also how we can be sexual in a really, really holistic and multifaceted way. I mean, pleasure is just not one thing, right? It's an integrated experience, but we lose that when we're reduced to our parts or reduced to our labels.
So what you're really saying is that women tend to be boxed into being sex objects, and men get boxed into being success objects.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of objectification going on for everybody.
Yeah, for sure.
But I think a really interesting point you made is that we objectify ourselves, and even women do this to each other.
Mm-hmm.
So I think there's a lot of actually intrasexual competition happening between women where, we compete on our physical attractiveness. And this is a lot of times also what's causing women a lot of distress and kind of feeling isolated, because there's almost a lot of bullying happening as well. So it's really hard for us to also find a supportive and empowering community, and that's why we're having these conversations too, because we want to really find a way to back to ourselves and freeing ourselves from those objectifications. Yeah.
I couldn't agree more. And that's systemically by design, right? When objects are competing with each other, they can't commune and fight the real oppressive systems, right? We're seeing that a lot right now in the political landscape. All of the divisiveness is not an accident. It's very intentional to keep us in a state of reductionism and fighting over those reductionistic parts so that we can't actually gather and join and say enough of this. There's plenty to go around, right? And women are definitely trained by patriarchy, by capitalism, by all of these systems to compete with one another for some mythical prize. I'm not really sure what that prize is, but you know, we are better when we stop and we gather and we commune together.
Deep breath.
Well, we are also hardwired, you know, speaking as an evolutionary psychologist, we are hardwired. You know, we compete, women compete with each other, men compete with each other because of, you know, sexual selection as well. So the prize is, if you ask me, it's always, the prize is always getting access to mates. And even I find, like, I hear it a lot from clients that I coach who are gay, you know, homosexual clients, they have it really rough as well, you know, being objectified in their community.
Well, we're also wired for cooperation.
Yeah.
So
Absolutely.
kids learn through
Absolutely.
rough and tumble play how to compete
Absolutely.
and how to cooperate. And I
And
think
we're
what happens,
losing that,
we're
right? We're
losing rough
losing
and
that.
tumble play. We're
Yeah.
losing in real life interactions.
Yeah.
It's really easier to objectify people when you're kind of anonymous, like there's really, you don't have to stay in the room with somebody when you're on, you know, on our phones and we're in social media. So you're right, Kate. I think this is built in, this divisiveness, because it makes people better consumers. They're going to get the product so that they can fix what's wrong. They're drinking the Kool-Aid rather than being in touch with their bodies and actually feeling.
Yeah.
You know, feeling, is this okay? Is this, you know, empathy, all this stuff that when you're actually in the room with people and you have skin in the game, you have relationships that you feel, then connection overrides competition.
Yes.
I love that. Beautiful.
Deep breath. I've been doing a lot of deep breathing the past couple of days.
Me too.
Yeah.
Definitely.
I'm right there with you, Nan. Lots of deep breaths.
Mm.
So
More.
what are the tools that you, or tips that you give in the books? Maybe you can elaborate a little bit on how we find that self-connection.
Yeah, I think one of the things that, a couple of things that I talk about in the last section of the book, what can I do about it, is really a guide for people to come back to themselves. And then from that place of connection with self, how do you then bring that into connection with partners or people around you? So there are chapters that help people reconnect with an embodiment practice, with a pleasure practice, with a really clear guide on how to think about your own boundaries. So what are your yeses? What are your maybes? What are your nos? And how do you get clear on that from an embodied knowing? And then putting it into practice. So staying in community with other people. I think one of the things I talk about in the book is how I'm so fortunate and so grateful that my friend group, we're super open about sex. We talk about sex all the time. And I mean, I'm probably a big part of why I try to normalize it as much as I can in every circle that we go into. But I think it's really important to have people that you can talk about sex with, even if they're not the people you're engaging in sex with, because it really does make it easier to ask questions and get feedback and learn about new things. And it takes away a lot of the shame. And shame is one of the biggest impediments to pleasure. So, you know, I really work on how to, you know, get back into engagement and connection with yourself and with other people, and with pleasure as a concept and a practice.
We have a question
Yes.
from one of our viewers. I think my problem is that I prioritize pleasure too much when I should be working. How does one know when this is true of themselves?
I have lots of thoughts. I'm curious what all of you think, and then I'll jump in.
Well, I think, you know, a lot of times it's all about like a dynamic balance, you know, to think about at the end of the day, you know, if you're really out of balance, I think that's something that to, you know, look, maybe you're using pleasure to self-soothe in a way and not addressing maybe what's really going, maybe it's affect tolerance, being able to tolerate some of the discomforts and the frustrations that come along with working and functioning. But I think a lot of it is like kind of like being in that. You ask such good questions in your book, Kate. What I love is the reflective questions.
Thank
So
you.
if you can think about the kind of questions somebody can ask themselves if they think they're out of balance,
Yeah.
like to really kind of check in and like, how are you deciding that you're not getting enough work done? You know what they say, is it getting in the way of your relationships? Is it getting in the way of your work? Just sometimes we're a little compulsive about pleasure. Some people are. I don't use the word addiction at all
Yeah.
because I don't think that helps. But people who are, kind of compulsive about pleasure seeking,
Yeah.
where it's not working for them, is, it's like that's great information to kind of lean into maybe what it is that's making them seek that soothing, that
Hmm.
they may be able to have a different relationship with those feelings, or make changes in their lives that might be necessary.
Totally. I couldn't agree more. And I think it's a really subjective process of asking oneself and answering for oneself how you really think about, what is my relationship with pleasure? And also, what is my relationship with deprivation? It's one of the first questions that I ask people when they ask me things like, am I compulsive? Is my sexual behavior too much? Is this a problem? One of the questions I want to understand is not only how do you think you might be indulgent, but how are you being deprivational? And when we can understand that continuum, we can start to find balance. The other questions that I might invite someone to think about are things like, are you neglecting other things in your life that are really important to you, right? If you don't care about video games, then maybe the fact that you're not playing them isn't a big deal. But if you do care about having a good relationship with your children and your relationship with pleasure is getting in the way of that, then it's time to re-examine your relationship with pleasure and think about, how am I prioritizing this? Same if it's affecting your relationship with work or your ability to take care of yourself otherwise or have other meaningful relationships, romantically, platonically, or otherwise. If it's getting in the way of things that you feel are really meaningful, then it's time to maybe start asking some bigger questions. But also, I think it's important to ask, to stay in that inquiry of, am I being deprivational? And is that why it's so hard for me to say no when I have these moments of time that are really important for me to get as much of it as I can? And I think that's really important in recalibrating how people show up with sexual and non-sexual pleasure.
Can you say more about that deprivational thing?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, you mentioned a lot of people can get compulsive with pleasure, and I think that's true. But we also can get really compulsive in other areas of our lives. We can be compulsively busy, compulsively working, compulsively distracting ourselves, and those are all forms of deprivation. They deprive us of pleasure, they deprive us of connection, mostly to ourselves, but also to other people. And it can be a state of procrastination that sort of deprives us from being able to reach a potential in ourselves that is important and that is available to us, or a creative part of ourselves that maybe we're afraid to access because of the vulnerability that comes with that. So there are lots of really insidious ways that we practice self-deprivation. Often it comes from a place of emotional neglect or other kinds of neglect growing up. No one modeled for us how to show up for ourselves and how to show up for other people in a way that was meaningful. So, from a neuroscience perspective, we may not have really developed those synaptic, journeys, those synaptic realities as adults. So, some practice might be required to build up that kind of skill in our lives as adults.
You mentioned childhood experiences, so that's something I know a little bit more about personally than I would like to. Uh, One of the things that kids who come from parental situations where parent might have a lot of trouble, with attunement, they might be suffering from some kind of issue themselves, mental health issue. Kids learn that they have to work really hard. If I just work hard enough, then I'll be good enough. And I think a lot of people have that sort of wiring. I know certainly I did. It didn't matter what I accomplished, it would never be enough, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm sorry to hear
So,
that. And
yeah,
also, it's so relatable. I think, like, just zooming out again, capitalism reinforces this idea in all of us, right? Like, we can rest when we save enough money, when we've worked hard enough. There's that whole conditioning again around pleasure. And yeah, a lot of parents carry that into their relationship with their kids unintentionally, more often than not. And it still can be really hard because then we get in this pattern of I have to prove myself and I'm not enough. Maybe if I can just reach this one milestone, I'll be okay, or I can take a breather, or someone will love me. But that milestone comes and goes, and we don't get that potential realized. So we raise the bar and we just keep going, and that's exactly where some of that deprivation can come from.
that's in my chapter 7 of my book, that we don't really understand how happiness works. And when you get to that, if I only get the PhD, if I get the book, you get there. And you know what I find with some very, very successful people in my practice? There's such a despair that they get because they thought at least if they got that money in the bank, they would be okay. And then they're like, holy shit, what do I do? And even some people feel that about their sex lives.
Yeah.
Like their sex lives are a certain way, but then, you know, like, oh, well, it didn't make me feel as good as I think. And then they sometimes think that they've just got to raise the bar and make it all more intense in some way for them to feel that level of, I think we're really talking about satisfaction, you know, because there's a big, difference in the brain between liking. That's the system of dopamine, liking, wanting. That's the dopamine.
Reward.
The
Yeah.
liking and the satisfaction is really mediated by our care system through our connections. So we're chasing the hungry ghost, thinking that it's going to be satisfying.
This is,
And
I think, also why people jump from one relationship to another, have to constantly change sex partners. And in your book, maybe you can talk a little bit about this, like what are some of our misconceptions about sex in the long term?
Well, I think that's a really big question, and we could go down many paths with that. But um, it's to your point. I mean, novelty and dopamine are huge drivers for lust,
They're
and that
fabulous.
it's yeah, it's part of why we do it, right? It feels so
Right.
good.
Yeah.
Um, and I think you seek that in long-term partnerships with the same person or with multiple partners. And I don't think that it is qualitatively better or worse to have more partners or one partner, because the brain is still going to be seeking what is novel, what is fun, what is dopaminergic. That's a big part of arousal. And, we have a lot of ideas about what partnership could involve, should involve, might involve. But one of the things that I think really gets lost for long-term partners is the process of rediscovering each other and making a commitment to infusing novel into the dynamic. And that can take many different shapes and forms and directions, but it is a commitment and it is a practice. It doesn't just happen automatically, because the more you know someone, the safer and more familiar they become, but the less novel. And so herein lies a big part of where lust can fall off in a long-term partnership.
and at the same time, were you going to say something,
I was just
Mo?
gonna say, if I had $1 for every time in counseling I talked to someone who was like, everything was great for the first year and a half, and I'm like, that's your dopamine. This is new relationship energy.
Ah,
Like, it is hard because people don't know in general that biologic mechanism, neuro mechanism, works to downregulate that in time. But then it is sad. A lot of people like mourn that loss, right? So to help them figure out ways to kind of reinvent fun or to make things novel is hard, and you have to encourage them. But I'm like, this was meant to happen. Like, it's good that you're still here. Like, let's figure out how to make it fun again.
Yeah, I think I love that. And I think when you recognize it as both an inevitability and a sign of potential safety, in
Yeah.
relationship, then you can stop seeing it as like this dark omen about the trajectory of your love together, and you can really get creative, right? In infusing newness and rediscovery of yourself first, and then your partner, because we're not static creatures, right? We are so dynamic. We're always changing and growing if we give ourselves the permission to do that. And that's really fun to figure out who you are today versus a year from now and 5 years from now. And that sort of that play between partners of figuring out who is my partner today, what's new about them that was different than yesterday. That's what really keeps that process of dopamine feeling a lot more organic and available.
Yeah, and taking the risks so that you're not being just in the relationship, you continue to relate. And taking the risks. Well, people are afraid to rock the boat, but you know what? Not rocking the boat will be a big risk. And you know, the thing is, I look at new relationship energy as biological highlighter. It gets our attention enough to then we want to pay attention to this person and say, is this person going to be a good partner? And then the skills of continuing to learn and grow as people, and then to bring that home. My husband has a saying, he always says, you can't fuck the same person twice. That's what he says. And he means that, you know, if you're really paying attention, the person is, if you're growing. And I think a lot of couples kind of like forget
Yes.
that when you get together, you're at one point in your lives, the relationship looks one way, but it's actually, can we call it pleasure activism rather than work? That you
Yeah.
continue to learn and grow and have caring play. And I think if you think of it that way, the lust for life, if we get turned on by life, we can come home and rub it all over our partners.
And the hard part too, I think, is that like in the longer term relationship and chronologically with like the world changing and your children changing and all the other things that kind of come along with like longer term partnerships, there are times I find a lot, especially I see more women identified people than anyone else because I'm a gynecologist, but I find that when they lose that other lust for anything because they're just on this treadmill, I mean, people are like, you know, every day is the same. It's like living in the movie Groundhog's Day, you know, that like if you can't turn on that excitement other places too and become someone new or reinvent something about yourself that you used to really love and fire you up, like they go hand in hand, like Nan always says. Like you can't have like anhedonia in your regular life and expect to have the world's best exciting sex life. Like we all need to take time with ourselves to kind of reinvigorate and seek and find and become new in order to make all of it fun, because we're all getting older, we're all kind of marching that slow march towards whatever, but it's if we grow and change together, I think that is the biggest, best way to kind of keep things like fun and interesting. It's hard not to lose yourself. I feel like it's really hard.
It's really hard, yeah, because we do get in a rhythm. We get in just sort of this like everyday rinse, repeat, and again, that can create safety, security. It gives us familiarity. We have something to lean on that's predictable, but it is the death of all things erotic.
Yep. It is.
One thing I would like to say, and I address this in the first part of my book, is I think we need to take a hard look at our relationship with our devices. Because if we're not actually in the room paying attention to each other, there's going to be nothing. There's a direct, I think, relationship between the advent of people spending so much time on their, devices and the sexual recession. Mm-hmm. So if you look at people, even when they're out to dinner, they're on their phones.
It's
they're
awful.
with their families and they're on the phones.
Every restaurant, everywhere. It's mind-blowing to me.
So we're just not paying attention. Where all that dopamine that could be going and fueling our interest and our desire, our exploration for each other, is getting sucked down into, doom scrolling and comparing ourselves to other people. So I agree with Kate. Social media and devices can be great places to connect, depending on how you use them and how much you use them. So I would really suggest, especially now with all that's going on, is that people really get off their phones and pay attention to themselves and each other. The viewer who said that he was, I'm assuming it's a man because I kind of think I know, that was worried about his relationship with pleasure. He said we nailed it for
Oh,
him. And he
good.
said, thank you. And then he said he's been in a partner. That's why I know he's been with his wife. I think this is a man for 25 years and never lost lust for her. So I think his pleasure system is working pretty good if he's got that lust for his wife. I think that there's something good there.
Yeah, we love that for him. That's amazing. Mm.
Deep breath. Deep breath. How do we prioritize pleasure when we're feeling so stressed out? I mean, that's something I think about a lot.
Yeah, I think the answer to that question for me is to lower your expectations. I think, well, what I mean by that is pleasure sometimes feels like a giant, arduous task. Like, who has energy for that when you're in that kind of burnt out place? So, lowering your expectations to me means making it a smaller ask, right? What do you actually need to do to have some joy in this moment? You may not need to get up and go unearth all your oil pastels and get a new canvas and paint this giant. I mean, that could feel like a wonderful hobby, but just way more than you have energy for in the moment. So, what do you have at your disposal instead, right? Some people really love a sweet treat that just gives them a moment to savor something. Other people might enjoy taking a quick shower or splashing some cold water on their face or rubbing some lotion on their skin. You know, we can look for opportunities where there are small moments. In fact, there's a really great book called Slow Pleasure by Euphemia Russell. And in it, Euphemia talks about microdosing pleasure. And I just love, love, love the way that that's framed, because that's the answer, in my opinion, to how do we get more pleasure? We do it in small doses that doesn't require a huge lift. And then it's easier.
You know what I hear from a lot of my clients is that they're just so out of touch with what gives them pleasure.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
they're not even thinking of, these microdoses. They're just like drawing a blank. So when people are so out of touch with, we're assuming that it's not that they're so horrendously depressed that they're unable to experience pleasure at all. But what are the kind of questions that people can ask themselves about how to kind of get curious about how they can find some tiny little microdoses of pleasure in the midst of everything else?
I think some of the questions that people can ask themselves are, what do I remember liking, right? If you can't access it today, do you have any memories that might give you a blueprint? But even if you can't, think about your senses. Think about what do you see, what do you hear, what do you taste, what can you touch, what can you smell, and really bring it back to a sensory experience. So, for example, I have a cup of matcha with me right here. And whether you drink matcha in the morning, coffee, tea, water, whatever it might be, can you take a moment and have a sip of it and think, what do I really like about this? What's pleasurable and enjoyable about this experience from the perspective of those five senses? And sometimes that really simple practice of just bringing it back into a sensory awareness can start to help you remember the things or identify the things that do bring you joy. And I see this a lot in folks that I work with who have grown up in really enmeshed family systems. They often weren't allowed to think for themselves, right? They had to go along with sort of the cohesive group think of their family. And as adults, they don't really know much about who they are or what they like as individuals because it's never been safe emotionally or relationally for them to think about those things and really put a stake in the ground. So a lot of the work that I do with them is helping them like revisit these things that are part of their everyday. So when you're washing your hair, do you like the smell of the shampoo? Do you like the texture of it on your hands or in your hair and your scalp? What does that feel like? how do you feel about the way it rinses off and washes over your body, and just kind of, developing a knowledge, right? A fluency between mind and body, between our conscious experience of knowing and our sensory experience. And that's a good starting point. And these are things that can be done in really small pockets of time.
And I love that too, because when you think about it, just kind of bringing mindfulness, you're tuning into the actual sensations. Come to lose your mind and come to your senses, kind of. That was a thing back in the day. And it's like, like I'll be honest, for me, a little tiny bit of marijuana. Like I microdose marijuana because I also have a lot of challenges with, my pleasure system at times. And what that does is really kind of increases. We talked with, for women who can't find their orgasms, marijuana can be a good treatment. But even the tiniest little bit of it for me is kind of gets me into sensation. And sometimes I can actually do that. I mean, let me make it straight. I'm not walking around doing marijuana all the time, but at the same time, just reminding myself of how I can drop into that space just using my mind. I've conditioned myself to create that experience of switching to the sensation channel. I don't always need to use marijuana to get there. Just like the woman who found her orgasm through marijuana, who was a guest on our show, Dr. Susan Mulvihill, doesn't use marijuana all the time to get her orgasm. I think whatever we can do, shift into paying attention to the sensations in the moment. You got your thoughts going on, but dropping into the sensations rather than just taking a shower while your head is racing into the next thing and the next thing.
Totally, right? Like we live in a culture that really supports us living in our consciousness from like here up, right? In the body. And when that's where we live, we lose out on all this really valuable information down here. And in our body, I mean, God, that's where all the reception is. That's where all of the sensation is. So yeah, can you invite just that awareness down into different parts of your body so that you can remember that it's there and remember how it feels.
And you said something before about these people not feeling safe to explore their pleasures. I think that's something that we need to remind people. A lot of people, they think they feel safe, but if you really ask into it, they're so used to sort of a level of how they feel that really isn't exactly feeling safe. So I'm suggesting to a lot of people, like, what we do with people who have trauma, first thing they need to learn is how to feel safe in the moment. And to relearn some things where it's safe to have pleasure. It's your job in a way to have pleasure. It's how your brain body works better, and that you can, because if you don't feel safe, you're not going to be able to relax into pleasure, just as competing systems in a sense.
Right. But safe is not, I talk about this in the book, safe is not a binary experience, right? We're not either safe or unsafe all the time. It's just not that black and white. So in the book, I invite folks to sort of think about safety as a continuum, because with pleasure, with connection, even in the healthiest of dynamics, there's risk that you could get hurt. There's risk that something could go in a way that doesn't feel great, or that could even be harmful, right, in the long run. So, we want to think about safety as an appraisal of risk. Like, what do I have the capacity to tolerate right now? Should it go wrong? Should something go off the rails? And we start with remembering to trust ourselves and learning to develop that safety in ourselves. So, if this person says something hurtful, for example, to me, do I know myself? Do I like myself? Can I be present with myself enough to pick up the pieces of that hurt? Right? And I think that's an important way to reframe safety, because so often we are hinging our safety on the behavior of other people.
Oh,
But
yeah.
The
right.
vulnerability, which
Yeah,
makes
but
things like fun in a way. Like it's that spectrum is kind of like being vulnerable to good or bad.
Exactly. Yeah, we can't have the good without taking the risk that something bad might happen. It just doesn't work that way. But I
No.
think we outsource our safety to other people, as opposed to thinking about how do I stay within myself? How can I be a safe person for me? And that really changes the context of how we set boundaries and how we choose to be around certain folks or not.
I also think that it's a nervous system thing because I think a
Yeah.
lot of people walk around in flight or fight, and then a lot of people spend a lot of time in freeze. So, we're so keyed up, like our nervous systems are not able to be more flexible to shift into that quiet, restorative tone. So that's what, I know has worked for a lot of people is learning how to be able to give your body cues, like to take that longer exhalation, to bring the vagal brake on, to tell your body that in this moment you are safe if you're just sitting there and breathing. And I love what you say about it being a continuum, because you can feel really safe in some circumstances and not so much in others. And I think if you think about that, something that you're aware of, like how much risk can I take in this situation that I'm comfortable with? And to be in that kind of conscious relationship with your ability to create the safety as opposed to wanting somebody to do that for you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's not to suggest that we are just these siloed ecosystems, right? Like we are in relationship with other people, so we do need other people to participate in the creation of safety with us. But it does start with understanding, like, what can I hold and handle in this moment, and then how do I advocate for that? Mm-hmm.
A dynamic sort of reappraisal.
Yeah.
So someone is saying, isn't danger in its own aphrodisiac?
Mm. So I think I love that question. And Nan, maybe you can speak to this a little bit more, but there's a certain element of fear that for some people can act as an accelerant for excitement and arousal, because it is part of the sympathetic nervous system, right? The part of our nervous system that turns us on, and can be excitable and can be fun. But I think there's a threshold, and that threshold is different for everyone, when it stops being exciting and it starts flattening people out, right? Or reducing desire and arousal. And everyone's threshold is different, which is, again, that sort of subjective barometer of what kind of risk can I tolerate right now? Because what's exciting and dangerous today might feel overwhelming and a shutdown tomorrow, based on what's going on in your body, what's going on around you.
I would think also it's like the Yerkes Dodds curve when it comes to anxiety mobilize. Like the sweet spot, like getting a little bit of anxiety can actually improve performance, but too much will shut it down. And I think when people, from my experience of hearing people that like to take risks like that get turned on, it's on their terms.
Yeah,
It's
of course.
on their terms. They're thinking about like, oh, let's go out and have sex like outside by the train, So they're thinking about what kind of risk they can, that kind of danger. But, I think there comes a point when you get too much fear, everything shuts down and there's going to be no blood flow to the genitals because it makes no sense whatsoever. If your body is primed to run from a saber-toothed tiger, all of the blood's going to go to your skeletal muscles. And I think this is kind of like how, a lot of times people who have, for example, ED, men who have ED, it's actually a lot of fear of performance failure that's kind of arousing their flight or fight system. Rather, you need a little bit. Those systems are always in a dynamic, balance. But if you got too much of the arousal, flight or fight, you're going to have reduced blood flow to the genitals. That's just how nature works.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I'm just laughing about here, where I know right now people are telling me a lot of things about not feeling safe. Okay, that's what I'm hearing from a lot of people.
Mm-hmm.
So I think if we think about, what we're learning today is that the pleasure activism is really, really important. being able to not get hijacked by the fear. You know, what happens if we get too afraid? We're going to freeze. We're going to feel awful. It's not going to do anybody any good. All right. So we need to think about how we can use our connections with ourselves and each other to ground, to feel connected, to get access to our pleasure, to continue these conversations. Like Kate, you wrote this book,
Yep.
and this book has so many great tools and questions and strategies for people. So I think I'm reading a fabulous book. Do you guys know the book Calling In by Loretta Ross?
You told me about it. I just ordered it. I haven't started it yet, but it looks
I'm
so
taking
fun.
her class. She's got an online class that you do lectures and labs with her. Because
Amazing.
I'm thinking, really like there's a whole lot of healing we need to do. And when we get fearful and angry, we want to call out and make everybody wrong who doesn't think anybody who's tolerating what's going on is bad or wrong. So I think this calling in, she really talks a lot about emotional regulation, recognizing we get angry. It's usually about pain underneath it and about working together. So I am so delighted that we are having this conversation and that we are going to pursue the work and keep
Well,
breathing.
speaks to what you were saying before, right? Our cooperation systems override our competition systems. And that is the thing that I hope anyone listening really takes away from today. Like when we are in community, when we cooperate together, so much is more accessible to us, in terms of pleasure, in terms of resources, in terms of all the good things that really we share in the human condition in a wanting, even if we have different viewpoints on what it means to get there.
So she says that if you look for the commonalities rather than look for the differences, that there's at some level something that's common. Like I have my son's in-laws are followers of the program.
Mm-hmm.
And what they say is what's important to them is our family. We never have any issues. Family, we care about our kids. We want to have comfort with each other. So I think we need to, especially now, reach across that aisle and find our priorities that we share with other people. I think that's how we're going to heal.
Yeah, and the same applies for our intimate relationships, right? When we find, what it is that we have in common and shared goals, maybe instead of just looking for, what's missing or what's lacking and where we're different all the time, that drives us apart. So looking for, and then you said it beautifully, it's relating.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's a great point, Lamore, because it's like we all have differences in our relationships. That drives most of the conflict is the core differences in how we're wired and what we do to kind of maintain our emotional stability, Something as simple, whether we're togetherness first or separateness first, live for the moment, plan for the future. And if we recognize that there's so much more in common than we have that is different, and we can find the understandable part. That can be challenging when the differences are very glaring.
Mm-hmm.
But there is something is making sense to people who are seeing things differently than us.
Yeah, yeah, that's true.
So I think we all have work to do, play to do.
Mm-hmm. We have play to do. I love
We
the
have
framing of that one.
play to do. We get to connect. We get to come from love. We get to come from care, curiosity, play.
Love it. Well,
Thank
thank
you
you
for your work, Kate.
all.
Thank you for your work, Maureen. Thank you for your work, Lemore. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you, ladies,
Thank
so much.
Thank
you.
And to
you.
all the viewers, thank you so much for being here with us.
Oh, thank you all so much for inviting me. This was such a lovely conversation. I'm so grateful to be here with you. And yeah, and thank you.
Thank you.
As the
Take care.
kids say, peace out.
Peace out.
Peace out. We'll see you soon. Bye.